They say the mountains hold secrets, but they never mention the ones that follow you home. I used to find peace in the silence of the wilderness, a sanctuary from the noise of the world. But that day, the silence didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a trap. I wasn't alone on the Blackwood Trail, and by the time I realized it, the exit was miles behind me. I started my journey at the break of dawn, driven by a restless energy that only the raw, untamed beauty of the Appalachian Range could soothe. Every step was a rhythmic percussion against the dirt, a heartbeat shared with the ancient ground. My pack felt light, my lungs felt full, and for those first few miles, I felt like the only living soul in a cathedral of ancient timber and golden light. I loved that feeling of insignificance against the vastness of the peaks, never suspecting that my solitude was about to be violated by a presence that defied every rule of the trail. The gold and amber leaves of autumn crunched beneath my boots, creating a peaceful soundtrack that masked the subtle shifts in the air around me. I had planned this excursion for weeks, selecting a path known for its breathtaking vistas and brutal inclines. It was meant to be a test of my endurance, a physical manifestation of my desire to overcome the stagnant weight of my office life. As I crested the first major ridge, the valley below was swallowed by a thick, white mist, looking like a frothy sea trapped between the granite walls. I felt powerful, my legs burning with a satisfying ache that promised a night of deep, dreamless sleep. I took a moment to drink some water, checking my map and noting that the next 4 miles were the most isolated section of the entire loop, where the trees grew thick and the light rarely touched the forest floor. It was just past the 4-mile marker where I saw him for the first time. He was sitting on a flat, moss-covered boulder about 50 yards ahead, his back turned to the path. He wore a heavy, charcoal-gray hooded sweatshirt that looked out of place for the unseasonably warm afternoon. I didn't think much of it then. The trail attracts all sorts of characters, from the elite gearheads to the casual wanderers. I offered a polite, breathy hello as I hiked past, but he didn't move or acknowledge my presence. His stillness was absolute, like a statue carved from the very rock he sat upon. I felt a brief prickle of social awkwardness, assuming he was just a hiker lost in some deep, solitary meditation. 10 minutes later, the trail looped around a steep ravine and climbed sharply upward toward the Devil's Pulpit. I was breathing hard, focused on my foot placement among the tangled roots, when I looked up and saw the gray hoodie again. He was standing near a twisted oak tree, looking down into the gorge. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of pure confusion. There was no way he could have overtaken me without passing me on the narrow path, nor was there a shortcut through the treacherous terrain of the ravine. I slowed my pace, the silence of the woods suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating. He still hadn't turned his face toward me, his posture remaining unnervingly stiff and patient. I tried to convince myself that I was seeing a different person, perhaps a twin or just another hiker with the exact same taste in drab, functional clothing. The mind is a master of deception when it wants to preserve a sense of safety, spinning elaborate webs of logic to shroud the growing instinct of danger. I told myself that he must have taken a side trail I hadn't noticed on the map, a faster route known only to locals. Yet as I passed him for the second time, the air around him seemed several degrees colder. I kept my eyes fixed forward, my pulse beginning to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The woods, once a sanctuary, were now starting to feel like a closing cage. Another mile disappeared under my boots, and I began to push myself harder, my casual hike transforming into a frantic race against an unspoken threat. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the trail was empty, just the long shadows of the late afternoon stretching like skeletal fingers across the path. But when I turned a sharp corner near the Whispering Creek, there he was again. This time, he was standing directly in the middle of the trail, less than 20 yards away. He was facing me now, though the hood was pulled low, obscuring his features in a veil of darkness. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, arms hanging limp at his sides, waiting for me to close the gap. A cold realization washed over me, a primitive dread that bypassed my intellect and spoke directly to my marrow. This wasn't a coincidence, and it certainly wasn't a fellow hiker enjoying the scenery. The forest had gone deathly quiet. The chatter of squirrels and the rhythmic tapping of woodpeckers had vanished, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. I stopped in my tracks, my hand gripping the strap of my bag so hard my knuckles turned white. My eyes searched for a weapon, but there was nothing but dry sticks and jagged stones. The man didn't move, didn't speak, and didn't breathe in any way I could see. He was a void in the landscape, a predator waiting for the right moment. I decided to test the reality of my nightmare, hoping desperately to be proven wrong. I stepped off the main path, pretending to examine a cluster of wild mushrooms near a dense thicket of ferns. I watched him through the corner of my eye, my vision blurring with the intensity of my focus. As soon as I moved, he shifted his weight, rotating his body with a slow, mechanical precision to maintain his orientation toward me. When I took 3 steps backward, he took 3 steps forward, mirroring my movements with a terrifying fluidity. The distance between us remained exactly the same, a calculated gap that felt like the tension on a bowstring ready to snap. My breath came in shallow, jagged gasps as panic broke. I couldn't take the psychological pressure any longer. The thin veneer of my bravery shattered into 1,000 pieces. I turned and bolted, my boots skidding on the loose gravel as I sprinted back the way I came. I didn't care about my destination anymore. I only cared about the distance between myself and the man in the gray hoodie. My lungs burned like I was inhaling molten lead, and the wind whipped past my ears in a mocking whistle. After a few hundred yards, I risked a glance over my shoulder, praying to see an empty trail. Instead, I saw him. He was running too, but his movements were a grotesque parody of human locomotion, his limbs flailing with a speed that was impossible. He was gaining on me, his heavy boots thudding against the earth like the beat of a funeral drum. Every time I looked back, he was 10 feet closer, his gray shape flickering between the trees like a ghost caught in a strobe light. I reached a fork in the path, where the terrain dropped off into a steep, rocky descent leading toward the river, a path I knew was dangerous, even in broad daylight. My mind screamed at me to stay on the main trail, but my legs carried me toward the edge, driven by a raw, animalistic need to disappear into the shadows. As I leaped over a fallen log, I heard a sound that chilled my blood, a low, rhythmic wheezing that wasn't my own. The wheezing wasn't a sign of exhaustion. It was a rhythmic, mechanical rasp that seemed to pulse in time with my own racing heart. Each breath I drew felt like swallowing shards of glass, the cold mountain air scouring my throat as I scrambled down the treacherous, shale-covered slope. My boots slid out from under me, sending a cascade of loose rocks tumbling into the dark abyss below, their clatter echoing like gunfire against the canyon walls. I reached out, desperate fingers clawing at the gnarled roots of ancient hemlocks, the bark peeling away like dead skin under my nails. He was right behind me, a gray smudge against the darkening green, moving with a terrifying, jerky precision that defied every law of human physics and predatory movement. I finally hit the bottom of the ravine, where the air grew thick with the smell of stagnant water and decaying leaves. The river was a churning ribbon of black glass, swollen by recent rains, and whispering promises of a cold, watery grave. I didn't stop to think. I couldn't afford the luxury of logic, while the sound of his heavy, rhythmic thuds approached the ledge I had just vacated. Looking up, I saw him silhouetted against the dimming sky, his figure elongated and distorted, as if the shadows themselves were stretching his limbs. He didn't jump or slide. He simply stepped into the air, descending the vertical drop with a predatory grace that turned my blood into ice water, his hood still obscuring his face. There was an old, rusted logging winch bolted to a boulder near the bank. a remnant of an industry that had long since abandoned these woods to the rot and the silence. I threw myself behind the heavy iron machinery, the cold metal biting into my palms as I pressed my back against the gears. My mind raced through every survival story I had ever heard, every urban legend about the man in the mist who allegedly haunted these trails since the late 70s. They said he wasn't a man at all, but a manifestation of the mountain's hunger, a collector of lost souls who wandered too far from the marked paths. I had laughed at those stories before, but now the laughter felt like a distant, cruel joke. The silence that followed his descent was more terrifying than the noise of the chase. I could hear the river's roar, the rustle of the wind in the canopy, and my own frantic, sobbing breaths. But he had become utterly silent. It was as if he had dissolved into the atmosphere, becoming a part of the fog that was now rolling off the water in thick, spectral ribbons. I risked a glance around the edge of the winch, my eyes straining to pierce the gloom. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of the clearing, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his head tilted at an impossible angle. He wasn't looking for me with his eyes. He was scenting the air, his chest heaving. Panic is a strange, multifaceted beast. It either freezes your blood or sets your nerves on fire. I chose the fire, lunging away from the winch and toward the riverbank, where the current was strongest. I remembered a shallow crossing about 50 yards downstream, a place where the locals used to ford their horses, but the darkness made every rock look like a trap. As I ran along the muddy bank, my boots sinking into the muck, I heard him start again. It wasn't a run this time. It was a series of long, bounding leaps that covered the ground with sickening speed. He was closing the gap again, his presence a heavy weight on my neck, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. I reached the crossing and plunged into the water, the freezing temperature instantly numbing my legs and stealing the air from my lungs. The current fought me, pulling at my waist with a relentless, liquid strength that threatened to sweep me toward the falls downstream. I clawed at the submerged stones, my fingernails breaking as I hauled myself through the churning white water. Halfway across, I turned to look back, and what I saw made me scream, a sound that was lost in the roar of the river. He was standing at the water's edge, but he wasn't moving to follow. Instead, he was reaching into the pocket of his gray hoodie, pulling out something small and metallic that glinted in the dying light. It was a whistle, ancient and tarnished, and when he pressed it to his lips, the sound it produced wasn't a high-pitched trill, but a low, vibrating frequency that I felt in my teeth. The vibration seemed to resonate with the very stones beneath my feet, making the water churn with a new, unnatural violence. Suddenly, the river didn't feel like water anymore. It felt like 1,000 hands reaching up to drag me down into the abyss. I struggled to reach the far bank, my muscles seizing from the cold and the strange sonic assault. I managed to grab a low-hanging willow branch and haul myself onto the muddy shore, coughing up river water that tasted like copper and ancient, forgotten earth. He hadn't vanished. He had just repositioned himself within the shifting curtains of the mist. I saw his reflection in a pool of still water further down the bank, but when I looked up, there was no one there. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable, a slow erosion of my sanity that felt more dangerous than the physical threat. I realized that he wasn't trying to catch me. Not yet. He was herding me, pushing me away from the trail and deeper into the dead zone, a patch of forest where the trees grew in twisted shapes and no birds sang. My compass had stopped working miles ago, the needle spinning aimlessly as if the magnetic poles were inverted by his presence. I stumbled into a small clearing dominated by an old, derelict ranger station, its windows shattered like broken teeth and its wooden walls gray with rot. This was my last chance for shelter, a place to barricade myself and wait for the morning light, though the sun felt like a myth from another lifetime. I scrambled up the porch steps, the wood groaning under my weight, and threw myself through the open doorway. The interior smelled of old paper and something metallic, like dried blood. As I turned to slam the door shut, I saw him again, standing at the edge of the clearing. He wasn't running anymore. He was waving, a slow, methodical gesture that felt like a permanent death sentence. The door groaned as I leaned my entire weight against it, searching for a bolt or a latch that had not been eaten away by decades of rust. My hands shook so violently that I could barely grip the wooden frame, the cold metallic smell of the station's interior filling my lungs with every ragged, desperate breath. Outside, that rhythmic waving continued, a mechanical and hypnotic motion that seemed to ignore the basic laws of human anatomy. I found a heavy, overturned desk and dragged it across the floor, the screech of wood on wood sounding like a dying scream in the oppressive silence. Through the jagged holes in the shattered windows, the forest looked distorted, as if the very air was warping around the cabin. I was trapped in a cage of rotten timber, waiting for a predator that had already won the psychological war long before the sun had even set. In the flickering light of my dying flashlight, I scanned the room for anything that could serve as a weapon or a means of communication. The floor was littered with old logs and yellowed reports dating back decades, their ink faded into illegible shadows by the passage of time. One ledger caught my eye, lying open on a dust-caked table in the center of the room, as if waiting for me. As I moved closer, I saw sketches, crude charcoal drawings of a figure standing at the edge of the woods, always in the same posture, always waving. The dates spanned over 50 years, yet the descriptions of the man never changed or aged. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a chase, it was a ritual, and I was merely the latest offering to a hunger that spanned generations. The sound started at the back of the station, a soft, insistent tapping against the external wall that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a fist, but more like the clicking of bare bone against dry wood. I retreated into the center of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs until it felt like it might burst through my chest. The tapping moved around the perimeter, tracing the outline of the building with chilling precision and intent. He was testing the boundaries, looking for a weakness in the structure, or perhaps a crack in my sanity. Every time the sound passed a window, I caught a glimpse of a long, pale finger dragging across the glass, leaving a trail of translucent slime in its wake. The silence that followed each circuit was even worse, a heavy, suffocating pressure. I spotted a trapdoor behind the desk, its iron ring gleaming with an unnatural luster amidst the decay. Desperation outweighed my fear of the dark as I yanked it open, revealing a narrow set of stone steps leading into a cellar that smelled of damp earth. I descended quickly, pulling the hatch shut above me just as the front door of the station exploded inward with the force of a falling tree. Above, the heavy thud of boots resonated through the floorboards, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. He wasn't rushing. He knew I had nowhere left to run in this desolate place. The cellar was small, filled with rusted canning jars that contained things no human should ever preserve. I huddled in the corner, clutching a jagged shard of glass I found on the floor, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then the voice started. It didn't come from above, but from everywhere at once, a discordant harmony of 1,000 whispers speaking my name in unison. It told me about the others who had come before, the ones who had tried to climb the peaks or cross the rivers, only to end up as echoes. The man's footsteps stopped directly over the trapdoor, and for a long minute, there was only the sound of my own shallow, terrified breathing. He began to speak in a language that sounded like grinding stones and rushing water, a tongue that predated the arrival of humanity. My vision blurred, and the walls of the cellar seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic life. I realized then that the man wasn't just a simple pursuer. He was a manifestation of the forest's ancient,
malicious intent.
The trapdoor was ripped upward with a single motion, the heavy wood snapping like a dry twig in the hands of a giant. He stood there, backlit by a moonlight that seemed too bright to be natural, casting a long, jagged shadow over me. I couldn't see his face, only the silhouette of a hat and a coat that draped over a frame that was far too tall and thin. He didn't jump down. He simply reached a hand toward me, his fingers elongating as they stretched into the gloom of the cellar. I lunged forward with the glass shard, screaming a defiance I didn't truly feel in my heart. My strike connected with something that felt like cold leather, but there was no blood, only a puff of gray dust. He caught my wrist with a grip like a steel vice. The world around me dissolved into a kaleidoscope of gray and black as the cabin vanished in a swirl of mist. I was back on the trail, but the trees were now made of bone, and the sky was a bruised, pulsating purple. The man stood before me, but he was no longer waving his hand in that rhythmic gesture. He was pointing toward a path that led further into the heart of the mountain, a trail that didn't appear on any map. I felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over me, a chilling acceptance that my old life was a distant, fading dream. My legs moved of their own accord, following the silent command of the entity that had hunted me. I looked down at my hands and saw they were turning the same pale, translucent color as his skin. Time became a fluid and meaningless concept, days and nights blurring into a single, eternal twilight within the dead zone. I understood the cycle now. The man on the trail was never one single person, but a role passed from one lost soul to the next. I saw a hiker in the distance, a young man with a bright red backpack, looking at his digital map with a confused, panicked expression. I felt the familiar urge to move, to be seen and then to vanish, to lead him deeper into the labyrinth. I began to walk, my movements fluid and silent, mirroring the man who had pursued me across the river. I found myself at the edge of a clearing, raising my hand in a slow, methodical wave. The hiker froze in his tracks. The cycle of the mountains demands a guardian, a shadow to remind the living that some paths are never meant to be walked by the feet of men. As the hiker turned to run, I felt the wind pick up, carrying the scent of copper and ancient earth through the twisted, bone-white trees. There is no escape from the dead zone, for once you are noticed by the man on the trail, you have already become an inseparable part of the landscape. My voice joined the chorus of whispers in the wind, a silent warning that would always go unheeded by those who crave adventure. The sun will never truly rise over these peaks again for me, and as I accelerate my pace to match the rhythm of the fleeing heart, I finally embrace my new identity.